on reforms, recently appointing a strategic advisor for SEND who will play a key role in engaging with practitioners, children and families as we consider the next steps in SEND reform.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I draw members' attention to my register of interest. Hertfordshire currently receives the third lowest SEND funding in the country, despite the number of children with educational health and care plans in Hertfordshire growing by 223% in the last decade. What steps is the Minister taking, along with her Cabinet colleagues, to create a fairer funding system that ensures all children, wherever they live across the country, can have the funding they need to support their education?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I do recognise the honourable gentleman's interest in this area and the interest from members right across this House in the urgent need to reform the SEND system. I would, however, just gently observe that the funding mechanism is one that we inherited from the party opposite, from the previous government, and that it was the last Conservative Education Secretary who said that the SEND system they've left behind was one that is lose, lose, lose. We are determined to fix it, Mr Speaker, to build up parents' confidence and to make sure that all children get the education and support that they need.
Natasha Irons.
Mr Speaker, and I welcome this government's commitment to halving violence against women and girls and its investment in the DAPO scheme in my community of Croydon. But Croydon's youth engagement team, which is focusing on helping to prevent young women being brought into gangs through grooming and abuse and vulnerability, are facing cuts due to budget constraints within the council. So what more can the government do to support local communities and local councils to prevent young women being dragged into grooming gangs and things like that?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My honourable friend raises a vital area. I think there is, excuse me, firstly, a very important role for youth services as part of that, but also there is much more that we need to do around safeguarding and the provisions in the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill around multi-agency child protection measures and much more besides, and the additional investment that we're putting into the system around children's social care will make a real difference in tackling the unacceptable exploitation that sadly blights the lives of too many children across our country.
Roundledge.
Question number 4, please, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Government has made and published its decision. We accepted the Ombudsman's finding of maladministration and apologised for the delay in writing to the women affected. We've started working with the Ombudsman to make sure lessons are learnt and will develop a plan for effective and timely state pension communications.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It's fair to say that people are disillusioned with politics and politicians because they feel that things don't change, not for the better anyway. And the Tories wouldn't compensate WASP women, and it looks like neither will we. And the Tories here in the SNP government in Holyrood have abandoned the workers of the Grangemouth refinery, and so far I have to say our government hasn't fared any better. So my question is a pointed one. Does the Secretary of State and the wider government not realise that if we don't provide the positive change that we promise and we improve living standards, then the next government could be a hardline, far-right effort that looks to impoverish society further?
Minister.
Well, I can reassure my honourable friend we've been elected on a manifesto of change, and change is what we will deliver. We've been working hard on Grangemouth. In the question of WASPI, we don't think compensation is appropriate. The evidence is that 90% of those affected did know there was a change coming out. Of course, we can't now work out who did and who didn't. But amongst those investigated by the Ombudsman, nobody lost financially from not knowing. So we couldn't justify paying out up to 10 billion in compensation. Instead, we're going to work to make sure the problem never happens again.
Colin Lockhart.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Women across this United Kingdom feel let down by this government, and rightly so. What will the Minister do to reassure those women by he needs to put action to his words and support these women who have been wronged for so many years right across this United Kingdom?
Well, Mr Speaker, we are going to work with the Ombudsman to make sure this never happens again. There will be a detailed report which will be published. We are committed to make sure that in the future sufficient notice is given of any state pension changes, and we're going to develop a communication strategy using the most up-to-date methods for state pension. For example, the Check Your State Pension service does give a forecast, including telling you when you can take your state pension.
Mary Glendon.
Number 5, please, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. This government is steadfast in its commitment to protecting single-sex spaces and committed to ensuring that services feel confident in providing them with better guidance. The AHRC will publish the revised code once it's finalised the draft and it has been approved by ministers. That follows the AHRC's consultation, which has now closed.
Very Clinton.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Government has recognised there is confusion or lack of awareness about the Equality Act single-sex exceptions and how to apply them in practice. So does the Minister agree that the updated AHRC statutory code is needed as soon as possible to make it explicitly clear that the Act provides for single-sex services for biological women?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It is vitally important that service providers have clear guidance about the Equality Act. The AHRC has already published non-statutory guidance on the legislation for separate and single-sex service providers, and the new government has also acted to underline that single-sex refuges, for example, are fully legally compliant, as I emphasised when I visited such a refuge in September. Thank you.
Ms Jarvis.
Question number 6, please, Mr Speaker.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and with your permission I will group this question with question 13. I'm not sure that Mr Speaker would allow me to go into quite the level of detail about the amount of discussions I have with the Home Secretary about this issue. It would take hours because it is every single day. But this weekend the government announced that we will be spending £13.1 million of funding to create a national policing centre for violence against women and girls and public protection, and that is due to launch in April.
Ms Jarvis.
Mr Speaker, according to the National Audit Office's report published on Friday, the epidemic of violence against women and girls is getting worse, and current prevention activities have largely focused on reducing reoffending rather than preventing initial offences. In Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, which includes my constituency of Eastleigh, there were 39,221 domestic abuse incidents and crimes recorded from April 2023 to March 2024. Following recent tragic events, what measures is the Minister taking to encourage prevention and foster the cultural change necessary to keep women and girls safe?
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady and the tone at which she takes about the domestic abuse in her area is one that I'm sure is shared across the entire House. The National Audit Office did in fact absolutely write what frankly can only be considered to be a damning indictment of the efforts of the last violence against women and girls strategy from the opposite side to where I'm sitting now, and we will do absolutely everything we can to ensure the prevention, both in education of those who perpetrate. That will be a fundamental part of our strategy, and unlike previous strategies, we'll actually do it.
Sarah Edwards.
Speaker, many women fear violence and assault on nights out, even more so when alcohol is involved and it's dark. In my constituency of Tamworth, the Tamworth Street Angels do vital work, ensuring that people feel safe in the town centre during the evenings, and they offer support when women need it most. Will the Minister agree with me that we should support organisations like Tamworth Street Angels, and will she join me in congratulating them on their recent King's Award for voluntary service?
Minister.
Gosh. I absolutely will join her in saying what amazing and vital work people like the Tamworth Street Angels are doing. It is unacceptable that women feel unsafe when they are out and about, and one of the things this government seeks to do is not just change legislation, for example on spiking, to make sure that it's okay and that our laws are right, but to make sure that on the ground we are actually training people in pubs, clubs, bars, in our nighttime economy, because words written on goatskin here, when the rubber hits the road in places like Tamworth, we need people like Street Angels to make sure it actually means something.
The Minister Seki Barter.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. 3 weeks ago, the government announced 5 local inquiries into rape gangs, which crucially cannot compel witnesses to give evidence. We still don't know where all of them will be, and we don't know how those towns will be chosen. As Charlie Peters from GB News originally reported, there are 50 suspected towns where grooming gangs are suspected to have operated. Does the Minister recognise that the failure to announce a meaningful national statutory inquiry means women and girls from across the country, who won't be from those 5 selected towns, will be denied justice, a fair hearing? And if the victims want a national statutory inquiry, why doesn't she?
Minister.
I have spent time with the victims that he speaks about. In fact, I will be going to see some more of the victims from around the country. I speak to these victims every single week, week in, week out. Unlike, I have to say, many of the people sat opposite me. And what I would like to say on this particular issue is that absolutely nothing was done previously to try and get to the truth in some of these cases. And we will absolutely do whatever we can to root out, as everybody in this House wants to see, while some of us wish to use it for political ends, an end to this particular crisis. We will be opening. We have offered to open up cases and have set the task force to do exactly that with any victim who wishes to come forward.
We come to topicals. Joe Morris.
Talking on one, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This month we celebrate LGBT History Month. LGBT individuals have shaped Britain's history and continue to contribute greatly to our society. We are also celebrating Race Equality Week and our commitment to raising living standards for everyone, putting more money into people's pockets through measures like ethnicity pay gap reporting. These initiatives demonstrate our commitment to fostering a more equal and inclusive society where everyone's dignity and rights are respected.
Joe Morris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The whole House will be aware of the importance of the Tyne Valley Railway line to my constituency. It's essential that our stations are accessible to all, and local campaigners like Tynedale Active Travel and Rosanna Lovett have expressed their frustration about the inaccessibility of stations across our beautiful constituency. So will she join me in commending their work to make travel truly accessible?
Mr. Speaker, I do join with my honourable friend. I know the Tyne Valley line very well, a very beautiful part of the country. It is important that the rail network is accessible for all passengers, and that is at the heart of our approach. I will make sure that Transport Ministers look into the case that he raises and provide some more information on what action is being taken for his constituents.
Secretary of State, Ms Davis.
The call for evidence the Leader of the Opposition started as Equalities Minister last year asked the public to share examples of bad guidance on single-sex spaces and services. This Labour government initially shared just 42 responses. That is 1% with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, the body that gives advice to institutions on equality in the law. Mr. Speaker, why did they rule out 99% of the public's responses? This is a massive betrayal of Labour's manifesto commitment to protect single-sex spaces. The public rightly deserve to have every single one of over 3,000 submissions considered properly by the EHRC.
We're on topicals again. We've got to keep it short and punchy. Watch the answer come back. Come on.
Mr. Speaker, the previous government's scope was narrow. We are taking action to give all providers the assurances that they need that single-sex spaces can be provided. I have met with the EHRC on this point. I have written to the EHRC on this point, and I will take no lectures from the party opposite on single-sex spaces when the use of mixed-sex hospital wards increased on their watch.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my living wage intern starts next week, just as a Sutton Trust report shows that internships are a critical entry point for careers, but that working class graduates are 20 percentage points less likely to complete an internship than their wealthier peers, and that most internships are never advertised. So what is my right honourable friend doing to ensure that career success is based on hard work and talent and not your parents' social networks?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. No young person should be held back by their background or expected to work for free. We remain committed to banning unpaid internships so that young people are paid fairly, and we'll set out further details in due course.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In Norfolk and Waveney, 44% of women on a gynaecology waiting list have been waiting longer than the 18-week NHS target for treatment, 1 in 10 over a year. These are the worst waiting time stats in all of England. So can the Minister tell me what conversations she's had with the Health Secretary to make sure that women in North Norfolk will no longer be left behind?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've had many conversations with the Health Secretary on this because it's unacceptable that women were let down because of the lack of action by the previous government. We're overhauling women's healthcare, placing women's equality at the heart of our agenda. That includes investing an extra £26 billion in the health system. Thank you.
Speaker, working class boys in the North East are being held back by an attainment gap that's based both on gender as well as income. The previous government had no strategy for dealing with such attainment gaps. What will this government do? Will you commit to a strategy on this?
Mr Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend. It is disgraceful that the attainment gap rose under the last government, and I won't rest until we deliver for kids from communities like ours. I agree it's not good enough that only 1 in 5 disadvantaged white British boys achieve grade 5 or above in maths and English at GCSE. We are determined to turn this around. We are investing more in our schools and in driving up school standards.
Ellen Maguire.
What steps is this government taking to improve female representation in all areas of sport, not just on the playing fields, but also in the commercial side of sport, including advertising, management and merchandise?
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. She raises an important issue. We do need to make sure that there is diversity where it comes to representation in sport at all levels, and I'd be happy to look further into the issues that she has raised today.
Too many disabled people reported being unable to vote at last year's general election. Will the Minister ensure that electoral administrators are reminded of their obligations under the equality law to ensure that disabled people can exercise their right to vote independently and in secret?
I agree with, as to the importance of the issue that my honourable friend identifies. I will make sure that the relevant minister picks up on this point and ensures that electoral administrators are aware of their responsibilities.
Rebecca Smith.
The government has a long-standing position that it does not engage with the Muslim Council of Britain. So why did the Disability Minister decide to breach collective responsibility to attend a recent dinner hosted by the MCB?
The government's position in terms of relations with the MCB has not changed. Thank you.
Committee, Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. It's the beginning of LGBT History Month. Trans people across the UK are struggling to access healthcare and finding it difficult to go about their lives with dignity, as their identity comes under constant attack from powerful people across the world. Progress cannot be taken for granted. So can the Minister please reconfirm the government's commitment to the entire LGBTQ+ community and outline what steps are being taken to engage with LGBT people in the UK?
Sorry, please don't do that, because I've got to get... No, it's no use shrugging your shoulders at me. I've got to get other members. If you don't want other colleagues to get in, please tell them I do. Secretary of State.
Mr Speaker, we remain steadfast in our support for all LGBT people. It is essential that they are safe, included and protected from discrimination.
Richard Alden, final question.
Indeed, Mr Speaker. Does the Minister consider incredibly high rates of first cousin marriage in certain communities of up to 100 times that in the general population, an equalities issue, and what discussions has she had with the Minister of Justice about it?
Mr Speaker, we continue to keep these matters under review. We are looking carefully at the Law Commission's report into marriage, published in 2022, and we will respond in due course.
We now come to Prime Minister's questions. Dr Neil Hudson.
Question number 1, Mr Speaker.
Brilliant. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I know the whole House will be appalled by the death of a young boy in Sheffield on Monday. Our hearts go out to his family and his loved ones. Knife crime blights our communities, and we redouble every step to ensure that young people are kept safe. Mr Speaker, on Monday, I met other European leaders in Brussels to discuss vitally important focus on security and defence in a volatile world. I'm determined to reduce barriers to trade, making it easier for businesses to do business, and ensuring a better relationship with our European partners delivers for the British people. Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Dr Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Sadly, suicide is the biggest killer of young people under 35. Andy Airy, Tim Owen and Mike Palmer are the 3 dads walking. They each tragically lost their precious daughters, Sophie, Emily and Beth, to suicide. And they have campaigned tirelessly for suicide prevention to be included in the school curriculum in an age-appropriate way. We met with the previous Prime Minister in Downing Street, and suicide prevention was added to the RSHE curriculum guidance for consultation last year. I know the Prime Minister has met the 3 dads and supports their campaign, but sadly progress has stalled. Please, Would the Prime Minister meet with me and the three dads so that we can finally get this over the line and ultimately save young lives?
Minister.
Well, can I thank him for steadfastly raising this really important issue, particularly during Children's Mental Health Week. I have met the three dads walking. They're inspirational. Their courage is extraordinary. And as the father of young children, I don't know how they're able to campaign in the way that they do. I'm not sure I would be able to do so. So, of course, I can assure him that I will meet them again and push this agenda, really important agenda, forward.
Yasmin Qureshi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 86% of trains at Kersley Station in my constituency were delayed or cancelled in the past 12 weeks, and this is widespread throughout the Bolton South and Walkden. My constituent Sophie, who commutes from Walkden to Manchester, recently told me almost every day at least one peak time train is cancelled, and when the train finally turns up, it's overcrowded. Recently, she was stranded for hours after constant cancellations because the train crews were unavailable. Can the Prime Minister ensure my constituents that this government is committed to building reliable railways after 14 years of Tory chaos?
Well, my honourable friend is right to highlight that the party opposite left our railways in a terrible state. 2 years of strikes costing our economy £850 million in lost revenue. You can't grow the economy if you can't run the railways. We will launch Great British Railways to focus relentlessly on passengers and to clamp down on delays and cancellations. And I'm pleased, Mr. Speaker, that Northern have announced the largest ever investment in its fleet to deliver 450 new trains, meaning more comfortable, reliable journeys for her constituents.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, when Labour negotiates, our country loses. Yesterday, we heard the government offered £18 billion for Mauritius to take our territory in the Chagos Islands. This is money that belongs to our children and their children. This is an immoral surrender, so North London lawyers can boast at their dinner parties. Mr. Speaker, when Labour negotiates, we all lose. Sometimes they don't even bother. Why did the Energy Secretary withdraw government lawyers from defending the case against the eco-nutters who want to obstruct Rosebank's oil and gas fields?
Mr. Speaker, let me deal with the serious issue she raises in relation to the Chagos case. This is a military base that is vital to our national security and to national security. A number of years ago, the legal certainty of that base was thrown into doubt. And let me, Mr. Speaker, let me be clear, and I'll pick my words carefully. Without legal certainty, the base cannot operate in practical terms as it should. That is bad for our national security, and it's a gift to our adversaries. Now, some within the party opposite know exactly what I'm talking about. That is why, Mr. Speaker, that is why the last government started negotiations about sovereignty and about securing the long-term use of the base. Mr. Speaker, they were right to do so. That's why the last government conducted 11 of the 13 rounds of those negotiations. And, Mr. Speaker, they were right to do so. That is why this government has completed that process, and we were right to do so. Mr. Speaker, I will set out the details when they're finalised, and it will, of course, be presented to Parliament. But if the Leader of the Opposition is properly briefed on the national security implications when she's asking these questions, which she's perfectly entitled to do, then she knows exactly what I'm talking about in terms of national security and legal certainty. If, on the other hand, she's not properly briefed on the national security implications, she's not doing her job, she's not concerned about national security, and she's not fit to be Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, how can anyone believe that this man is defending UK interests when he bends the knee to anyone who asks him? answer was so weak and so waffly, it is no wonder he needs a voice coach. But he didn't answer the question I asked him, why the Energy Secretary was not defending our country. The Energy and Environment Secretaries received nearly £400,000 worth of donations from Lisbeth Rousing. It's her money behind the court case that will stop an £8 billion investment, threaten thousands of jobs, and endanger energy security for all of us. Did the Energy Secretary refuse to defend UK interests because he's funded by billionaire eco-zealots?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll come to that very issue, but I noticed she didn't say she was briefed about the Chagos issue. This is important. Mr. Speaker, when she became leader of the opposition, I said to her that I would give her a briefing on any national security issue if she asked for it. That's very important to the way that we run our democracy. She has not asked for a briefing on the Chagos case. And that's because she's more interested in chasing reform than in national security. In relation to oil and gas, it'll be part of our energy supply for many years to come. We've been absolutely clear about that. But we are going through a transition. It's important because that transition to renewable energy will give us lower bills, energy security, take Putin's foot off our throat, and it's good for the national interest.
Mr. Speaker, this is a weak answer because he doesn't know what is going on. Last week, I asked about the employment bill. He didn't know what was going on. We asked about the education bill. He didn't know what was going on. Let me tell him what is going on. Maybe he can answer some questions. Shell has said a one-year delay to Rosebank will cost £350 million and the loss of 1,000 jobs. Equinor has said a two-year delay to Jackdaw will cost £800 million. The only benefit I can see is the £400,000 to Labour ministers. At a time of war in Europe, threatened energy security, increased competition from the US and elsewhere, we should be getting British oil and gas out of the ground. Does the Prime Minister have the guts to take on Labour donors and his Energy Secretary and approve the licence applications when they are resubmitted?
Prime Minister. Speaker, she doesn't even want to know what's going on, otherwise she'd have asked for the relevant briefing. She knows the position on Rosebank. She knows the court case that has meant that the licence has got to be reviewed. There's a process that's got to be gone through in the proper way. She understands that, but yet again she's proving all she can do is student politics and playing party politics.
Mr. Speaker, I am speaking on behalf of the people of this country. When Labour negotiates, our country loses. When Labour negotiates, our country loses. He's talking about bringing growth and investment. Last week, he lost a £450 million investment from AstraZeneca that we negotiated, Mr. Speaker, and which would have delivered growth immediately. That same day, he also lost the £8 billion oil field investment that would have delivered next year. Business is abandoning the North Sea because of his decisions. What signal does he think he is sending to investors?
As she knows, AstraZeneca was a commercial decision. She must understand that. But, Mr. Speaker, all she does is come here every week, carping from the sidelines, talking our country down. We've got the highest investment for 19 years. PwC say the second best place to invest in the world. The IMF has upgraded growth. Wages are up. Inflation is down. There's more to do. Reforming planning and regulation. Building new homes. Supporting a runway, the third runway at Heathrow. What unites these? Championed by Labour, opposed by the Tories.
Mr. Speaker, it's so hard to believe anything he says. This is a man who needed emergency voice coaching on Christmas Eve. This government is so clueless. It is borrowing £8 billion. It is so clueless. It is borrowing £8 billion for GB Energy, a vanity project that is not great, not British, and does not produce any energy. Its own chairman, Mr. Speaker, admitted it will take 20 years to create just 1,000 jobs. Meanwhile, 200,000 jobs are at stake in our oil and gas sector right now. Does he think that 1,000 jobs in 20 years' time are worth more than the 200,000 jobs we have now?
Prime Minister.
Again, she clearly hasn't been briefed or doesn't want to be briefed. GB Energy, a publicly owned energy company that will drive the move to renewables. That is not about the number of jobs in HQ. It's about the thousands upon thousands of jobs they will generate to give us energy security, something we didn't have under the last government, take Putin's boot off our throat, something we didn't have under the last government. They lost control of the economy. We're getting it back.
He can waffle as long as he likes, Mr. Speaker. But we know that Labour promised to bring energy bills down by £300. Instead, bills are going up. He's freezing pensioners while shoveling money to Mauritius. The Prime Minister isn't just managing decline, Mr. Speaker. He is creating decline. He has the power to grant these licenses, open these oil and gas fields, save British jobs, and bring down bills. Why does he find it so hard to do the right thing?
Right. She really needs to look into how these licences are granted. Well, I appreciate that their reset seems to be having no policies apart from cutting pensions and having no briefings on relevant issues. Let's just remind ourselves, they presided over the biggest drop in living standards on record. Mortgages went through the roof and they left a £22 billion black hole. And we learned last weekend, Mr. Speaker, that under the last government, £35 billion was lost on benefit fraud and error. Who was at the Treasury at the time, you might ask, Mr. Speaker? The Shadow Business Secretary and the Leader of the Opposition. They want to give lectures. No thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member for Clacton says that his party is, and I quote, open to anything when it comes to changing our NHS and open to an insurance-based system. So can my right honourable friend confirm that under a Labour government, the NHS will be there for everyone when they need it, not having to worry about the bill?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the NHS is the lifeblood of our country, and that's why we invested £25 billion at the budget, a record amount, and we're making it fit for the future through our plan for change. What a contrast with Reform, whose leader has said that those who can afford to pay should pay for our health care. Under Labour, the NHS will always be free at the point of use for anyone who needs it.
Leader of the Liberal Democrats, Sir Ed Davey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister about the terrible murder of the 15-year-old in Sheffield and say that we will support any effective action against knife crime that the government proposes? At his first Prime Minister's questions, I told the Prime Minister about my constituent Andrea. A full-time carer for her mother, Andrea is one of thousands of carers caught up in the carers' allowance scandal, hounded by the DWP for repayments. The Prime Minister accepted there was a problem and set up an independent review, and we welcomed that. But 2 months after the announcement of the review, Andrea received a letter summoning her to a tribunal next week. Her mother's health has been deteriorating. She's had to go in a care home. This is the last thing Andrea needs. So will the Prime Minister step in and do the right thing and cancel Andrea's tribunal and all proceedings against carers like Andrea, at least until the review is concluded?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we set up the independent review, and I know he welcomes that and it was the right thing to do. I don't know the details of Andrea's case, but I will certainly, if he provides them to me, make sure that we have the details and look into what's happened in her particular case.
Sir Ed Davey.
I'm grateful for that reply. The Secretary of State for DWP wrote to me and wasn't interested in engaging, so I hope the Prime Minister will. Mr. Speaker, turning to foreign policy now, last night many of us were alarmed to hear President Trump speak about forcibly displacing 1.8 million people from Gaza. The Prime Minister has spoken to the President on several occasions now. Does he personally believe that Trump recognises the dangers of statements like this to the fragile ceasefire in Gaza and indeed to the security of both Palestinians and Israelis? I'm glad that the Foreign Secretary has confirmed that the government's position is still a two-state solution. I think that has support on all sides of the House. But will he reassure the House that this position and our concerns on these dangerous statements from the President will be communicated to the White House directly and firmly?
Yeah. Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you raised a very important issue. The most important issue on the ceasefire is obviously it's sustained. We see it through the phases, and that means that the remaining hostages come out and the aid that's desperately needed gets into Gaza at speed and at the volumes that are needed. I have, from the last few weeks, two images fixed in my mind. The first is the image of Emily Damari reunited with her mother, which I found extremely moving. The second was the image of thousands of Palestinians walking, literally walking through the rubble to try to find their homes and their communities in Gaza. They must be allowed home. They must be allowed to rebuild, and we should be with them in that rebuild on the way to a two-state solution.
Patricia Perks.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The announcement of a third runway at Heathrow is obviously a massive boost to growth in the economy. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it is important that the economic boost is spread around the UK? And will he therefore agree to ask the relevant minister to meet with me and other Glasgow MPs and with the Chamber of Commerce to discuss the possibility of a new supply chain hub being created in the city where materials for Heathrow's expansion could be reassembled?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, she's right. The new runway at Heathrow can boost economic growth across the whole of the country. It would boost the economy by billions and create over 100,000 jobs across the UK, with 60% of the economic benefits outside London and the South East. It is, Mr. Speaker, good for Scottish passengers and Scottish businesses, particularly Scottish salmon, which is the #1 export passing through Heathrow, worth £970 million over the last 5 years. I'll obviously happily make sure that she gets a meeting with the relevant minister.
Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. If I can assure the honourable member for Rugby that Reform want healthcare to be free at the point of delivery. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mr. Speaker. There appears to be some panic on that side of the House. I'm not surprised. To ask the Prime Minister, I'd like some advice, please. What do I say? Oh, they really are panicking, aren't they?
Order. I want to get this question over with. All you're doing is ensuring it goes on forever. Quick question.
To ask the Prime Minister for some advice, what do I say to 25,000 constituents in Clacton, including...
Either get on. No, you've got it. No, we're not both standing at the same. Look, I need a quick question, then I can get you the answer. Come on.
What do I say, Prime Minister, to 25,000 constituents in Clacton, including 99-year-old Jim O'Dwyer, who flew a full set of missions on Lancaster bombers as tail end Charlie, as they're losing their winter fuel allowance, feeling the pinch, whilst at the same time we're prepared to give away a military base and pay £18 billion for the privilege of doing so.
Mr. Speaker, he talks of panic. The only panic is people using the NHS who know that under his policy he wants to charge them for using the NHS. And what he should say to the people of Clacton when he finally finds Clacton is that they should vote Labour because we're stabilising the economy and boosting the jobs.
Mr. Speaker, many of my Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents in Folkestone and Hythe are expressing their frustration at the previous Tory government net migration figures, which quadrupled, increasing by nearly 1 million. But unbelievably, the Shadow Foreign Secretary has admitted that her party is proud of their open borders experiment on Britain. So will the Prime Minister explain what he is doing to bring these numbers back under control?
Well, I'm grateful to him for raising this because we know that the Leader of the Opposition personally lobbied to remove annual limits on student and work visas. The Shadow Foreign Secretary still thinks they got a great record on immigration, forgetting that they quadrupled immigration, reaching almost 1 million a year. Our borders bill will give stronger powers than ever to tackle people smugglers. We've already removed 16,000 people with no right to be here. The question for the opposition is, will they walk into the lobby with us next week to secure our borders?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. After she was kidnapped and shot, Emily Damari was held in captivity by Hamas in UNRWA facilities, confirming many of our fears that UNRWA is riddled with Hamas sympathisers. So, the British people do not want our aid being stolen by Hamas. So will the Prime Minister agree with me that we should stop funding Hamas, follow the example of other nations and divert our aid to other, more trustworthy agencies?
Prime Minister.
On the question of Emily Damari, I've spoken with Mandy on many occasions, including when she didn't know whether her daughter was alive or not. And just listening to her was to really understand the torture that she went through. I spoke just the other day to Emily herself about the conditions in which she was held, and of course will continue to do so. But to be absolutely clear, and he knows this, we're not funding Hamas. Never will we condemn Hamas, and everybody in this House should condemn Hamas.
Sarah Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 54,000 women a year lose their jobs when they are pregnant or on maternity leave. 1 in 10 HR managers say they would be reluctant to hire a woman whom they thought was might start a family. Law has not solved this. Will the Prime Minister please meet with me, Dad Shift and Pregnant Then Screwed to discuss the ring-fence paid paternity leave that is needed to bring about change?
Prime Minister.
She raised a very important issue in relation to maternity pay and maternity leave. The Leader of the Opposition thinks that maternity pay is excessive, and that's the difference. We know that workers' rights are pro-growth, and I'm proud that our Employment Rights Bill will introduce parental leave from day one, which means 1.5 million more employees will be entitled to unpaid parental leave and 30,000 more fathers to paternity leave. I'm happy to ensure that she gets the meeting with the relevant minister.
Gagan Mahindra.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that, like everyone in the House, the Prime Minister is an honourable member. On that basis, can you repeat his assurances that all rules were followed while the country was in Tier 4 lockdown in December 2020, not just by him, but as his team as well, but also his voice coach, Leona Mellinger?
Mr. Speaker, in December 2020, I was in my office working on the expected Brexit deal. With my team, we had to analyse the deal as it came in at speed, prepare and deliver a live statement at speed on one of the most important issues for our country in recent years. That's what I was doing. What were they doing? Suitcases of booze into Downing Street, partying and fighting, vomiting up the walls, leaving the cleaners to remove red wine stains. That's the difference. I was working, they were partying.
Louise Hay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the whole House will support the Prime Minister's comments and send our thoughts to the family and all those who loved Harvey Wilgoose after his tragic and senseless death on Monday. I support the government's actions to tackle the sale of certain knives online. But before national media attention moves on from yet another tragic death of a young person, I know the Prime Minister will agree with me that in order to tackle the scale of the crisis engulfing too many of our communities, we need a whole system, cross-government approach to tackle the root causes of violence. Will he commit his government to tackling such a national strategy?
Prime Minister.
This incident was horrific and senseless, and I thank you for raising it. I think the thoughts of the whole House are with the victims' family, friends, and the school community and the wider community who've been impacted by this. We're all grateful to the first responders, the police officers and the medical staff who attended the scene, and it's right that South Yorkshire Police are given the time and space to carry out their investigation. We do need to do everything we can to bear down on knife crime. It is too easy to get knives online. It's too easy to carry knives without proper consequences. And that's why we've made it an absolute priority in government. And I hope it's a cross-party issue to absolutely bear down on knife crime.
James McCreary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the Prime Minister will share my deep concern that families in my constituency of Lewis, particularly those with disabled children, face agonising waits for essential adaptations to council housing. In my inbox, I have cases where delays have left people unable to use a bathroom or even access a kitchen to simply make a cup of tea. Will the Prime Minister meet with me to discuss how we can ensure councils have the funding they need urgently to build and retrofit homes to ensure that all children have the start in life they deserve?
Minister.
Look, can I thank him for raising this really important issue for his constituents and actually so many constituents. I'm pleased to confirm that we've put down £69 billion for councils. That's a 6.8% cash terms increase, including up to £3.7 billion in vital additional funding for social care. We've doubled the funding for the Disabled Facilities Grant, an additional £86 million, to allow 7,800 more disabled and elderly people to make improvements that enable more independent lives, and will continue to do so, working across the House.
Rudd Snell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 83 proud pottery workers woke up on Monday morning with no job following the collapse of the 200-year-old Royal Stafford pottery firm. It is a crisis in our ceramics industry. Escalating prices for energy and fake and foreign imports is causing a real problem. So could I ask the Prime Minister if he, through his offices, can arrange for the energy companies to meet with Ceramics UK and the GMB as the voice of the workforce so we can hammer out a new deal? And can he promote, through public procurement, buying British so that proud manufacturing jobs in Stoke can be protected?
Minister.
Well, I'm grateful to him for raising this really important issue, and it is obviously a question of jobs, but it's also a question of identity and a sense of place. And of course, we'll work with the energy companies, and of course, we'll have the relevant meetings, as he suggests.
Colin Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Agnes lives in my Bicester and Woodstock constituency. In 2019, when she was 9, she was referred by her GP to Child and Adolescent Mental Health Services, CAMS. Agnes has had to wait over 9 years for an assessment for the neurodiversity that has caused her crushing mental health problems. Last year, when Agnes's dad, Jim, sought to accelerate her appointment, he was told that CAMS could not see her or prioritise her appointment, and I quote, unless Agnes is actively trying to kill herself. Jim asked me to raise this case today because he wants to ensure that no other child goes through the same experience as his daughter. Will the Prime Minister meet with Agnes, Jim and me to hear their story?
Minister.
Can I thank him for raising this issue in that way, and pass on to Agnes and Jim just how impactful what he has said is, and how important it is that he continues to raise this issue, because far too many children and young people are waiting far too long to receive the mental health support that they need, and we're determined to ensure more children and young people can access high-quality mental health support in a timely manner. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thayos.
Llandudno is a beautiful seaside town and wonderful place to visit, but businesses are struggling with the rise in shoplifting. In many cases, thieves are stealing a full view of staff because they just don't fear the consequences. The recent funding boost for neighbourhood policing is very welcome, but could the Prime Minister please tell my constituents what more this government is doing to tackle retail crime and deter repeat offenders?
Prime Minister.
Well, for far too long, crimes like shoplifting have been written off as low level. That's wrong, it's devastating, and the party opposite left us with rising crime and effectively told the police to ignore shoplifting under £200 worth of goods. We've got rid of that shoplifters charter and working hard to make sure that we take a grip where they lost control.
William. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston and Surbiton, I wanted to raise an equally troubling case. My constituent retired from the police force to care for his wife, working a part-time job to help pay the bills. As his earnings were not consistent, there were times he was above the carer's allowance threshold, causing later payments to be withheld. He's now owed thousands of pounds, and recently he's been diagnosed with grade 4 glioblastoma, which has made the situation even more serious. Will the Prime Minister agree to look at this situation and ensure the Department for Work and Pensions supports rather than penalises carers?
Prime Minister.
Again, we've obviously set up the independent review into exactly what happened in these cases, which was the right thing to do. We will look at individual circumstances. So again, if she's willing to pass the details to me, we'll look at them.
Joanna Baxter.
Mr. Speaker, Audit Scotland recently exposed the incredible funding crisis facing our councils in Scotland. £759 million of a funding gap. They also reported that the 12 councils that make up the Strathclyde Pension Fund are reducing their employer contributions from 19.3% to 6.5%. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that instead of taking money out of workers' pensions, that the Scottish Government appropriately fund our councils?
She's absolutely right to point out the failure of the government in Scotland. They don't want to talk about that failure. They've got the powers, they've got the resources, they just haven't got any excuses left.
Close question. Yep.
The honourable member asks about visiting Scotland. As he knows, my first visit as a Prime Minister, within days of becoming Prime Minister, was to Scotland, where I met the First Minister. I've also been for the meeting of the Council of Regions and Nations in October, Interpol General Assembly in November, the British-Irish Council in Edinburgh in December, and look forward to going again very soon.
Ed Duggan.
Interesting, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister couldn't tell me when he was going to be coming to Scotland next. But does he agree with the withering assessment of the eminent politics professor Sir John Curtis, who says the current UK Prime Minister is the worst thing to happen to Anas Sarwar? And if he doesn't, and he should, does he think it's stripping Scottish pensioners of their winter fuel payment, or abandoning workers in Grangemouth, or attacking the national insurance payments of farmers? Does he believe that is what's catastrophically torpedoed Labour in the polls in Scotland? So when he does get a date, he can even bring his Chancellor with him to back him up on the numbers, assuming she's still the Chancellor by then.
I remember when that rhetoric used to come from them sitting down here.
Order. Mr. Dugan, I want... Order. Mr. Dugan, I want no more. Prime Minister.
He has to shout, Mr. Speaker, because they're so far up there, so few of them, that they can't get heard without shouting.
My constituent Matthew and his mum Catherine, alongside Emma Murphy and Janet Williams, have campaigned for many years to get compensation for families affected by the epilepsy drug sodium valproate. 12 months on from the Patient Safety Commissioner's report on this matter, those harmed are still waiting for the recommendations to be implemented. So can I ask the Prime Minister how much longer individuals and families impacted by valproate will need to wait for the clarity they seek? And will the Prime Minister arrange for the Health Minister to meet with valproate campaigners to discuss this important matter?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this is obviously a really important matter. I understand the Minister for Patient Safety did meet patient groups before Christmas to hear their stories and their accounts and experiences firsthand. And we will provide an update on the Patient Safety Commissioner's report at the earliest opportunity to the House.
Saoirse Eastwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all know how the song goes. You gotta know when to hold them, when to fold them, when to walk away and when to run. And we've done all of them in Northern Ireland because the system of government that we have is a gamble. Well, I'm not prepared to roll the dice on the people of Lagan Valley who have already been without government 40% of the time. Secretary of State for Northern Ireland says he wants to stop the cycles of collapse. So do I. But don't then turn around and tell us in Northern Ireland that we can't deliver public service transformation if no steps are taken to stop the collapse. The people of Northern Ireland who I represent, nationalist, unionist and unaligned like myself, are all out of aces. Our public services are on the floor. Will this government be the one to step up to the plate, reform the institutions, end the veto and stop rolling the dice on the people of Northern Ireland?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, since 1998, the Good Friday Agreement has delivered a far more peaceful society in Northern Ireland, and that is really important. Restoration of the power sharing was a significant milestone and allows the institutions to make progress on the most important issues to the people of Northern Ireland, and will continue to work with all parties to that end.
Jill Furness.
I was delighted to recently visit Chaucer School, a great school in my constituency with fantastic young people and innovative and motivated teaching staff. But 14 years of Tory government did not do enough for more than 300,000 children across the country attending schools that are stuck and kept receiving poor Ofsted judgments. Will the Prime Minister set out how this government will tackle inequality and tear down barriers to opportunity through our plan for change?
Mr. Speaker, the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill will ensure that all schools can innovate, new teachers are qualified, and every child receives a consistent core education to set them up for success in life.
Dr. Danny Chambers.
Mr. Speaker, 5 months ago, the Care Quality Commission reported that 2/3 of maternity units in England were unsafe. And years of unsafe staffing levels have resulted in the NHS paying an astonishing £1.15 billion a year in compensation due to avoidable injuries caused during childbirth and sometimes deaths. The previous Conservative government have allowed maternity services to deteriorate to the point where many consider it to be a public health crisis. Will the Prime Minister commit to improving maternity care and women's health services as a top priority so our maternity unit in Winchester and those around the rest of the country are the safest places in the world for women to give birth?
I thank him for raising this important issue. Women and babies deserve the highest standards of care through pregnancy, birth and the months that follow. We're committed to recruiting thousands of new midwives for the NHS whilst providing support to trusts failing on maternity care. Mr. Speaker, we're working with the NHS as it delivers a 3-year maternity plan, which is making good progress in improving services, including for his constituents.
Final question, Michael Wheeler.
Mr. Speaker, last week I had the opportunity to visit 2 of the local job centres that serve my constituency of Worsley and Eccles. The dedication of the staff I met to helping our local community, supporting people into work and adapting to the area's needs was inspiring. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that we must listen to their frontline experiences as we look to remove the barriers to work that keep people locked out of jobs, and will he visit these teams with me to see the work they do?
Well, I thank him for his question. Our Get Britain Working White Paper sets out the biggest reforms to employment support in a generation, backed by £240 million of investment. And through our plan for change, we'll boost living standards, more secure, rewarding jobs to make work pay. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. No. Right, we now come to the urgent question. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs if it will make a statement on the negotiations of the transfer of sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius.
Minister.
As we and Mauritius have repeatedly said, including in joint statements on the 20th of December and on the 13th of January, both sides remain committed to concluding a deal on the future of the Chagos Archipelago, which protects the long-term effective operation of the UK-US base on Diego Garcia, and securing the long-term future of the space has and remains our primary objective throughout this process. And following technical talks, Mr. Speaker, between the UK and Mauritius last month, we have made very good progress towards this deal. Both sides have agreed that, given the importance of the base to the United States, as well as ourselves, it is right that the new US administration has the chance to consider the full agreement properly, which I discussed with the honourable gentleman in the debate yesterday in Westminster Hall. We are closely engaging with the administration, including, of course, sharing the full details of the agreement, Mr. Speaker, and it would not be appropriate or usual for me to give a running commentary on the detail of those discussions or the agreement. Parliament will have the opportunity, as I've said on a number of occasions, Mr. Speaker, to scrutinise the deal in the usual way, and following signature, the Government will bring forward a bill to enable implementation of the treaty. I must reiterate, Mr. Speaker, that the Government inherited a situation where the long-term future of the military base, which is vital to UK and US security, as the members opposite know, was under threat. The previous Government recognised this, Mr. Speaker, and that is why they began negotiations in 2022 and held 11 rounds of negotiations. This Government has secured a deal that protects the base for at least the next 99 years, which can be extended, and this means the UK and the US will be able to operate the base unchanged well into the next century. There will be clear commitments, Mr. Speaker, in the treaty for robust security arrangements, including preventing the presence of foreign security forces on the outer islands and ensuring the base can continue to operate securely and effectively. And we would only agree a deal that we are confident protects our national security and that of our allies.
Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Mauritian Parliament had the opportunity yesterday to debate this at length. It seems perhaps you were rather more reluctant to be here today. Jonathan Powell, our National Security Advisor, has been doing the rounds in Washington, and he's been telling everybody, including the new Cabinet members, that this is necessary, that we have to give away the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands, and that in those circumstances, a negotiated 99-year lease is the best option. But of course, that's just not true, is it? It just isn't true at all. It doesn't stand. There is no legal basis on which we have to give away the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands. An advisory judgment from the ICC has no force of legal power whatsoever. Indeed, America disregard it so much, they're not even members of it. And I am pretty convinced, and by the way, they've been fairly busy with foreign policy, the Americans, just lately, so perhaps no wonder that Diego Garcia has not been high on their agenda. But when the Americans wake up to the fact that this has been done wholly unnecessarily, I wouldn't be surprised if we find ourselves, together with the European Union, in their tariff regime. Can the Minister confirm there is no binding legal basis for this transfer of sovereignty whatsoever?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I mean, the honourable gentleman goes over ground that he has gone over before and which I've answered in this House and indeed discussed in the debate yesterday. We've been very clear, as indeed the previous government was, that this base was not on a secure footing, and this has been done in full agreement with the US national security apparatus across the place. And he referred to the ICC. Of course, it was the ICJ which made that judgment. And we are very, very clear that that joint UK UK-US base on Diego Garcia plays a critical role in countering an array of threats to regional and international security, and we will not scrimp on security. We will not scrimp on the security of that base, the solidity of the agreements around it, and ensuring that it is in operation well into the next century and that we're able to operate unimpeded as we do today. And that is exactly why the previous government recognised there was a problem and engaged in this process, and it's why we have brought that problem to a conclusion with a deal that protects our interests, protects the interests of the United States, and ensures the security of that base and its operation. As I've said, Mr. Speaker, once that treaty is signed, it will be put before the House for scrutiny, before ratification in the usual way. And Mr. Speaker, I do have to say that the chuntering from opposite, the opposition seems to have collective amnesia over this. They know fully the reasons behind this. Many of them were members of the previous government. You've heard what the Prime Minister just said in relation to the Leader of the Opposition's attacks. We are very clear this is about defending the UK's security, putting the base on a secure footing and securing that for the future for us and our allies.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At the most recent Environmental Audit Committee, we heard about the importance of the Chagos Islands in terms of the marine environment. Can my honourable friend tell us any more about the specific reassurances that we've had about that crucial area in terms of biodiversity in the marine environment and how that will be protected after this deal? Any discussions that he's had?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my honourable friend for his very important question. It was a delight to appear before his committee to discuss other matters just a few weeks ago. This treaty reflects both parties' shared commitment to uphold international environmental law, including high conservation standards across the archipelago. Mauritius has expressed dedication to marine conservation and has aligned its global initiatives to protect 30% of marine areas by 2030 and their commitments under the SDGs, and establishing a fit-for-purpose MPA is a crucial part of that, and we're going to work with them very closely on this. This was a very important part of the discussions, and I'm very glad that we've been able to make the agreements that we have.
Secretary of State, Dame Priti Patel.
Let us be very clear. Labour's disastrous deal is one of the worst foreign policy failures in modern British history. Labour are surrendering an absolutely critical strategic defence asset which we operate together with our closest security partner, and now we're told we've got to pay billions for the privilege of doing so. When Labour negotiates, Britain loses, and loses big time. While this House has been kept in the dark about the details, our counterparts in Mauritius, Mr. Speaker, have not. They had a robust debate in Parliament, and many of us watched it on YouTube, which was just extraordinary, where the Mauritius Prime Minister gave his Parliament a detailed account and even a chronology, Mr. Speaker, of the deal and negotiations that led to it. The details Labour have repeatedly refused to disclose to this House, and the Prime Minister of Mauritius set out in no uncertain terms that nobody should be any doubt. So this week, hapless government has backed down, Mr. Speaker, and I think this House deserves answers today. Has the Minister given away our ability to unilaterally extend the period over which the UK can exercise sovereign rights on Diego Garcia? Because the Mauritius Prime Minister says he has. Has he given away our ability to exercise sovereign rights over Diego Garcia entirely? And if so, what is the cost? Is it 9 billion? Is it 18 billion? Is it to be inflation-proofed, as the Mauritian Prime Minister stated in Parliament yesterday? And if he is front-loading payments, what other services will be cut here in the United Kingdom in the immediate term to make room and pay for this? When Labour are imposing taxes on education, family farms and businesses and have cut winter fuel payments, Mr. Speaker, for vulnerable pensioners, how can this be justified with this eye-watering amount of money to lease back a territory for which, guess what, we already own the freehold? Can he also say whether he will have to make defence cuts to absorb this enormous cost? Should the MOD be shouldering these costs? What budget will this come from? Will the government count these payments towards a 2.5% defence target? And on the sovereignty of the bases, does this pose, Mr. Speaker, a new precedent for other bases such as Cyprus? And the Mauritius Prime Minister said last month that his AG met the Minister and the Attorney General. So can the Minister confirm what was discussed? And importantly, can I just reiterate again, if the government thinks this is such a good deal, does he still stand by that? And is he going to defend our interests?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do have to say again to the Right Honourable Lady that it was her government, a government that she was part of, that started these negotiations, went through 11 rounds of negotiations. She knows full well the reasons why. And quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, I find it extraordinary for her to be talking about defence and national security of this country when we are having to rebuild and clear up the mess that they've made in our armed forces and in our defence. I'm very glad to be joined here by the Minister for the Armed Forces, because it's this government that is rebuilding our defence, increasing our spending and delivering for our armed forces and our national security around the world. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, this is a crucial part of this. A lot of the figures that are being speculated about in the media, quite frankly, should be taken, as I said yesterday, with a pinch of salt, Mr. Speaker. We have been clear there is no change to the substance or the quantum in relation to this agreement. She raised inflation. I'm surprised she mentions that, because it was there in the agreement and the public statement that was made about the negotiations on the 3rd of October of indexation. And indeed, that was part of the agreement that her government was previously part of. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm very surprised that she asked that question. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, I am deeply disappointed, as are indeed our friends in the overseas territories around the world, that constant comparisons, false comparisons, keep being made with our other bases, our other overseas territories. This is not a read-across situation. We are committed to our base on Cyprus. We are committed to Gibraltar. We are committed to the Falklands. We have been absolutely and resolutely clear about that. And to continue to do so, to continue to suggest that there is some sort of threat to those, quite frankly, undermines our national security and does not strengthen it in any way.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister agree with me that despite the member for the Trump government's misrepresentations in this debate, that the UK government must provide its own independent global leadership based on UK values and UK interests to make a safer world, despite or because of the new US administration's change in foreign policy, including closing USAID and the Chagos Islands?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I set out yesterday in a very important debate on our bilateral relations with the United States just how much we are cooperating already with the US administration on defence, on security, on our shared priorities around growth and prosperity. We are absolutely committed in our wider international obligations. We've set that out. Minister Dodds has set that out. My colleagues in relation to climate change have set that out. And we will continue to work with the United States on all the global challenges that we face.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I put on record the deep concern of the Liberal Democrats at the way in which this deal has progressed. We accept the ICJ ruling. I thought there was a consensus across this House on the importance of the UK upholding the rule of law. So I'm bemused by the confected consternation of the Conservative benches. It was the then Foreign Secretary, the Right Honourable Member for Braintree, who said in 2022, and I quote, "It is our intention to secure an agreement on the basis of international law to resolve all outstanding issues." But under this Labour government, Chagossians have been ignored, Parliament is without a say, and the lack of foresight as to how the US presidential election might affect this deal is troubling. After failing to rush through an agreement, ministers have now given Donald Trump a say about the future of sovereign British territory. So can the Minister confirm that before signature, this House will be given a vote on the terms of the final deal, in particular to see how UK security interests have been protected?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've set out on a number of occasions why this deal is right for our national security interests and those of our allies, and I've also set out very clearly the process, the normal process, that it will go through Parliament.
Alex Burris-Curtis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for the response to the UQ. I listened carefully to the Honourable Member for Clacton's concerns about the deal. And, Mr. Speaker, I'd say if those concerns are about the possible costs, then given his register of interest states he's earned over nearly £600,000 in the last 6 months since his election, perhaps the Minister might agree with me, he could make the Honourable Member for Clacton could make a donation to the government in order to secure our national security.
Order. I'm sure you want to ask a serious question, actually.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and apologies. Will the Minister just reassure me that in the response to the statement that he's given and to counter statements before, that when this treaty comes before this House, it will be absolutely at the paramount forefront of this government, which is securing our national security, a process, as he said, which was started under the last government?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we won't scrimp on national security, as I've said. There's been no change to the substance of the deal, nor the overall quantum agreed, and we will present the process in the usual way, as I've said on multiple occasions.
Thank you. Oh, which Andrew?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to try and be helpful to the Minister. I was the Deputy Foreign Secretary throughout much of these negotiations, and I am in a position to tell the House that neither my right honourable friend for Braintree nor his noble lordship Lord Cameron in the other place, as Foreign Secretary, would ever have done the deal that the government are now intent upon. And can I say that I think he must be praying every night for a get-out-of-jail-free card, that when the American administration do come to look at this deal, they will veto it and get the government off the hook.
Mr. Speaker, I've set out very clearly the reasons for doing this deal. It's the right deal for our national security and that of our allies. He knows that because his government started the process, and we are absolutely engaged in constructive discussions with our US counterparts. It was absolutely right that they had the chance to consider this deal, and we will allay any concerns that have been raised in this House before in terms of the security provisions that are there. They are being provided the full detail of this agreement.
Calvin Bentley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member opposite says that he wants to help with UK relationships with the US, but he has a very funny way of going about it. The members opposite state over and over again that they understand the desires and the psyche of the US military and of its people, and yet they ignore the fact that the ICJ rulings aside, the US, its present and previous administration, understand the language of business and agreements and not the gentlemen's agreements of the past that have marred discussions and negotiations about the stability and persistent military presence on the islands. It's for this reason that I asked the Minister if he will agree with me that the confirmation of the legal status of this base will cement our role in the Indo-Pacific and put us in a strong position to counter Chinese influence within the region.
Well, he's absolutely right about protecting against malign interests, and that is exactly at the heart of this deal. He's also exactly right about the history of why this deal was needed, and that was, of course, recognised by the previous governments, why they started the negotiations. We wanted to put this base on a secure footing well into the next century, which was indeed what I assume they were trying to do previously. They spent 11 rounds negotiating. We've come to a deal which is in our national interest, and most crucially it is our national security and that of our allies which is at the heart of this. There are multiple safeguards in place in the treaty, and those will protect our national security and that of our allies.
Desmond Sway.
Given what he's told the House today is so at variance with the report of the Prime Minister of Mauritius, surely it raises in his mind alarm bells about the nature of the polity and the individuals with which he's negotiating. And has he entirely lost his moral compass? We are considering, the government is considering taxing death-in-service benefits of our servicemen at the same time as contemplating spending £18 billion on saving a base that we already own.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to reflect on the appalling record of his previous government on defence and for our service people, and we're getting round to rebuilding our relationship with our armed forces and rebuilding our defences, given the global threats that we face. He asked about the Mauritian Prime Minister. The Mauritian Prime Minister, of course, is responsible for his own words. I certainly don't recognise some of the commentary that there's been over the last 48 hours. It's clear that there has been no change to the substance of the deal, nor the overall quantum agreed.
Jacob Colley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has set out the conversations that he's had with American allies, but I wonder if he could update the House on the conversations he's had with the wider NATO partnership, given the consequences that this could have on them.
Well, our NATO partnership is utterly crucial. We have a NATO-first strategy. The Prime Minister was with the Secretary-General just in the last 48 hours. I was with NATO colleagues at the North Atlantic Council just before Christmas, and we are absolutely clear in our commitment to our NATO allies. We're clear in our commitments to the United States. They form the bedrock of our security in a globally uncertain time, and that is also why we need to secure the base into the long term, into the future.
Dr L. Pinkerton.
Mr. Speaker, a few weeks ago I had the privilege of meeting a large group of Chagossians who had come sometimes as far as France to speak to members of Parliament about their feelings towards this deal. They told us, and I was one of only 3 MPs who turned up to that meeting, and I have to say they were devastated by that turnout as a consequence. They told us that they have not been in any way meaningfully consulted about this deal. The Minister has a challenge on his hands. He told this House that meaningful negotiations, meaningful discussions had to take place. He has a choice today, I think, either to confirm precisely what those consultations and negotiations were, or to correct the record. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I am rather confused by that question. I've been very clear about the engagements that I've had with the Chagossian communities, which have been twice, and I've set out the dates on which those took place. We continue to engage with Chagossian communities. In fact, actually, my officials will be meeting with Chagossian communities next week, and I look forward to meeting them again in due course. He will also respect, as I've said many times, Mr. Speaker, the range of views within the Chagossian community. And, for example, the Chagos Refugees Group, one of the largest Chagossian groups, has welcomed the agreement. So there are a range of views. I respect the differences of views that there are, and there are a range of Chagossian groups around the world, as he knows. We'll continue to engage with and listen to all of those views. But I can assure him that the interests of Chagossians are very much at the heart of this agreement.
James Cleverly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister, and indeed the Prime Minister before him, keeps implying that if members of this House were armed with the same information that they were armed with, that they would come to the same decision. Well, I was armed with the information that he has at his disposal, and I did not come to the same decision. And neither did my direct successor, Lord Cameron of Chipping Norton. Does he and the other ministers of the government and the officials that work on their behalf understand that the point of a negotiation is not to get any deal, but to get a good deal? And if you do not get a good deal, you should walk away from the table as we did. That's right.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said before, he recognised there was a problem. He started a negotiating process. They went through 11 rounds, and this is a good deal, and that's why we've agreed it.
Mr. Speaker, the international rules-based system has been the cornerstone of both our economic prosperity, as the hundreds of billions wasted on a pointless Brexit have illustrated, and our security for years. China doesn't get that. Russia doesn't get that. The current occupant of the White House doesn't seem to get that. Does the government get that?
Well, we are absolutely clear that national security is our top priority. We need to maintain our security in all parts of the world. We're in very dangerous geopolitical circumstances, which I think all members of the House would recognise, and that's exactly why we're investing in our defence, in our NATO partnership, in our relationships with the United States, with our European counterparts and many others, and we will always put the national security of our citizens and our country first.
Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I've asked the Minister this question before, but if he'll forgive me for saying so, his answer could have benefited from additional clarity. So, with your permission, Mr. Speaker, I'm going to ask it again. The Minister's been very clear, as have his fellow ministers, that the urgency and necessity of action here is based on the imminence of an adverse court judgment against the UK. He knows that the International Court of Justice is not the court we must be thinking of here, because the UK is not subject to the compulsory jurisdiction of the ICJ when it involves disputes involving members or former members of the Commonwealth. Correct. So it cannot be an ICJ judgment the Minister is worried about, can it? So if not, what is it?
Well, I've set out on a number of occasions, and his previous government knew the reasons why it was necessary to move forward with the deal to secure the future operation of the base. That was very, very clear, and why our allies wanted us to secure the future operation of that base. I'll just give them another example. Of course, currently we have unrestricted and sole access to the electromagnetic spectrum, which is used to communicate with satellites. Spectrum, of course, is guaranteed and governed by the International Telecommunications Union, which is a UN body based in Geneva. If we lose it, we can still communicate, but so can others. And that's just one of the many examples. There are a whole series of aspects here that are important to the operations and the security of the base and its maintenance into the future, and to be able to operate unimpeded. And I can tell him that all of those considerations have been part of the reasons why we have come to this deal, and in terms of the protections that we've secured that are part of it. We would not have agreed a deal that didn't secure the operation of the base into the future unimpeded, but also left it continually under risk, which is what it is at present.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker,
We haven't been able to get any facts from the government as far as the cost is concerned, because of course the deal is inflation linked and we don't know what inflation in the future will be. But we do know 3 facts. First of all, that this is a crucial base for our national interests. Secondly, that China is seeking to expand its influence across the Indian Ocean and Africa. And thirdly, that the Mauritian government will have clear, unambiguous sovereignty of the islands. So how can he anticipate that our interests are safeguarded if he doesn't know what relationship future Mauritius governments will have with China?
Mr. Speaker, I have answered this question on a number of occasions before. Mauritius is one of the few African countries not to join the Belt and Road Initiative. Their alliances with India. We have clear guarantees in this treaty to set out the protections against malign interest on the outer islands and indeed in the area around it. That's, of course, why the whole of the United States security apparatus agreed to this. We would not have agreed a deal that did not protect. And I'll give you some examples, Mr. Speaker. Full UK control over Diego Garcia, including control over the electromagnetic spectrum and unrestricted access to and from the base, the buffer zone around Diego Garcia, in which nothing can be built or put in place without UK consent, and of course various different robust mechanisms and review process to ensure that no activity in the outer islands or around can impinge on the base operations. He can absolutely be assured that we would not have agreed a deal that would allow any malign force, wherever that might be from around the world, to be able to use the space around the islands or to interfere with our operations. This is about putting the base on a secure footing into the future for our national security and that of our allies.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Both the Prime Minister and the Minister just now have stressed the strategic importance of the military base at Diego Garcia. Can he therefore make clear that there will be no restrictions in the lease as to what the base can be used for or what might be stored there, and that the UK will have the right to extend that lease when it comes to its expiry? Right.
Mr. Speaker, I can absolutely confirm there will be no change to the operations of the base. That's the base on which this agreement is founded, and all the provisions and protections within it. It's for a 99-year lease with the possibility of extension at the end of it. I've set that out in my answers previously.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister assure us he's not going to be dragged down the road of rebuilding the empire as he's been invited to by the member for Clacton? And will he confirm that in international law the Chagos Islands in their entirety have become part of Mauritius, and that we should be concentrating on the right of return of all Chagosians to the islands, which they've been campaigning for ever since the 1980s, when they were so disgracefully removed. This is an issue of decolonisation and their right of return. I'd be grateful if he could confirm that any agreement with Mauritius will include the automatic right of return to the archipelago, and at least the rights of visits and residence briefly, if necessary, on Diego Garcia itself. They've suffered too long, too hard, and been treated so brutally that they deserve justice.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I must say, of course, the primary purpose here is national security and ensuring the functioning of the base. But he is absolutely right to raise the issue of the Chagosians and their treatment in the past, which we all agree was wrong. Their interests have been absolutely at the heart of this. This agreement will, for the first time, mean, A, we can resume visits to all the islands, including Diego Garcia, with the appropriate protections in place. Hopefully, settlement to those outer islands. That's part of our discussions with Mauritius around the treaty. And, of course, Chagosians can actually, of course, subject to the relevant security clearances, work on Diego Garcia as well. So we are very in recognition of their historic lands and graves and other things and the history, and our package of measures to support the Chagosian community, both globally through a trust fund, but also here in the UK, will be a very, very important part of this. That's some of the issues that we look forward to engaging and discussing with Chagosian representatives over the weeks to come.
George.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the US has the most substantial interest in Diego Garcia, which is, after all, the fulcrum of what we're discussing today. And whilst I understand that the Minister cannot disclose the detail of the compensatory package which is being negotiated, is it reasonable to assume that the US will be making a substantial contribution to that compensatory package?
Well, I'm not, as I've said, Mr. Speaker, going to get into a running commentary on the discussions. What I will say is that the full details are being shared with the current US administration. It was absolutely right that they had the chance to consider those. We're always being accused of rushing. Of course, this has been going on for over 2 years, lengthy rounds of discussions and lengthy rounds of negotiations, mostly under the previous government. But of course, it's absolutely right that the new US administration have time to consider the deal and to be provided with the details, particularly around those security issues, that they can be absolutely sure about the security of the base and its operation into the future for their interests and for our interests.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's outrageous that we only know the detailed speculation of this deal because of the briefing from the Mauritian Prime Minister to his members of Parliament. It is outrageous that the amount of money being talked about now is £18 billion, which is enough to pay the winter fuel allowance of all our pensioners for the next 12 years. The Minister will not tell this House what the actual quantum of money is that he is discussing with Mauritius. Can he put it on the record now? And can he tell us out of which departmental budget it needs to be paid?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I can tell her that figure that she just pulled out there is categorically untrue. And Mr. Speaker, I would say that she had the answer to her question in the question that she asked me, which she said speculation. There is a huge amount of speculation. I would take the vast majority of it with a pinch of salt.
Let's see. Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend, the member for Kenilworth and Southam, spoke incredibly slowly and incredibly clearly, so much so that even I understood his question. However, the Minister didn't actually give him an answer. When we joined the ICJ, we did so on the basis of a carve-out that meant no ruling by the ICJ in respect of Commonwealth or former Commonwealth countries could be binding upon His Majesty's government. So is it the ICJ that he is concerned about or another court?
Well done.
Mr. Speaker, as we've said repeatedly, the base was not on a sustainable footing. This deal puts it on a sustainable footing.
Dr. Andrew Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What does it say about this government's priorities? That it will deny pensioners the winter fuel payment, it'll leave waspy women with nothing, that it will fail to support jobs on Merseyside by supporting AstraZeneca at speed, and that it should be contemplating an emergency budget to raise taxes more on hard-working British people while spaffing £9 billion on Mauritius.
Mr. Speaker, I wasn't entirely sure what the question was there. If he was talking about his government's economic legacy to this government, I think we would have a substantial disagreement. The fact is we're picking up the pieces from his government and the mess that they've left this country in, economically and otherwise, and crucially in terms of our national defence. We will not scrimp when it comes to our national security. We won't scrimp when it comes to our armed forces. We won't scrimp when it comes to our overseas basing and our commitments to our allies, and that's exactly why we're getting this deal.
David Mundell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer to my entry in the Register of Members' Interest. There's never been, Mr. Speaker, a satisfactory explanation as to why this deal was rushed out hours before a very, very unpopular government called a general election in Mauritius, creating the impression that this government was attempting to interfere in the democratic process of Mauritius, and the outcome of that was that that government secured only one seat in the Mauritian Parliament after the general election. So can the Minister finally tell us what the imperative was to rush that deal out in that time frame, hours before an election was called?
Mr. Speaker, again, I refer to my previous statements. There has been no rush. We've been engaging with our Mauritian counterparts. We've been engaging with the United States administration. We believe we have a deal here that meets all of the interests of those involved and that protects, crucially, our national security. There is no rush.
Dave Dougal.
Speaker. This matter must be so important if it consumes so much of the Minister's credibility and £18 billion of taxpayers' money. You would think there would be more than 4 government backbenchers here to speak about it. Is it that they don't care, or they lack the literacy to discuss these issues? And when the Minister was on the Today programme this morning saying that we have passed the situation on to the White House and we await their feedback, and when we receive it, we will know exactly where we stand as a government. Is that the type of sovereignty he's after?
Good question.
Well, there were so many different bits of that question I didn't recognise, Mr. Speaker. I mean, I wasn't, for a start, I wasn't on the Today programme this morning, so I don't know who he's referring to, and I certainly don't recognise the 18 billion figure, so I don't really understand what he's getting at at all.
None of us objected.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has already confirmed to me in a written question last week that we wouldn't have a unilateral ability to extend the agreement. In December, the Honourable Member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport informed us that when we see the detail, he was confident members would back it. This is seemingly a renegotiated deal, and we haven't seen the detail of the original deal or this deal. So what are the differences between the previous deal and the renegotiated deal, and when will the details be presented to members in this House?
Mr. Speaker, there has been no change to the substance of the deal, nor the overall quantum agreed, and we will present it in due course to go through the normal process of scrutiny in this House.
Jim Allister.
Simple question, Mr. Speaker. Does the government disagree with anything that the Prime Minister of Mauritius said yesterday about this deal? And if so, what?
Well, Mr. Speaker, referring to the answer I gave a few moments ago, the comments of the Prime Minister of Mauritius are for him to make. As I said, there's been no change to the substance of the deal, nor the overall quantum agreed. We believe we've achieved a deal that's in the interests of the UK and Mauritius, and indeed of the United States and our allies.
Joshua Reynolds.
Parliament's been without say on this, despite numerous efforts to raise concerns. So why should Donald Trump have a say about British sovereign territory, where British elected officials do not? So when will the Minister ensure that this House is given a final say on the deal?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this House will have a final say on the deal in the usual way of how these measures are considered, and there will be legislation laid in due course. It is absolutely right that the United States administration have the chance to consider this deal and to raise concerns, to get briefed on the full details. That's the absolutely right thing to do. That's why we've given them the time to do. Of course, our relationship with the United States over these islands is also governed by international law, the exchange of letters between the United States and the United Kingdom, and it's absolutely right that we meet those obligations too, as well as, crucially, our absolutely shared commitments to security in the Indo-Pacific. So it is absolutely right that this is agreed, and it has been with the US national security apparatus prior to the election, and now, of course, it's right that the new administration get their chance to look at that and ask the questions that they wish to do so.
David Reeves.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the FCDO team please confirm who is the lead minister on these negotiations?
Well, Mr. Speaker, these negotiations are between the two governments. There are a range of interests at play. There are a range of ministers who've been involved in the negotiations. And, of course, there are equities here for the FCDO, the Ministry of Defence and other parts of government. So it is a joint HMG negotiation.
Dr Neil Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This Labour government is making choices. Choices claiming that they have no money. From taxing jobs, family businesses and family farms, cutting winter fuel payments for pensioners, to delaying much-needed new hospitals like Whipps Cross and the Princess Alexandra. What does the Minister say to my constituents in Epping Forest, who are asking, how can this government now find billions of pounds to pay to give away British sovereign territory, and in so doing, compromising national and global security?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I simply don't accept the premise of his question. We will not scrimp on national security. We will invest in our national security. We will secure our bases. We will invest in our armed forces. We will invest in our defence, and we will protect the British people. And we won't scrimp on that. We will invest in it, unlike his previous government, which did.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Minister, I always like try. I know I might have a different opinion. I always try to be respectful in the question put forward. So I hope the Minister will receive it as such. The Minister will be aware of my opposition, indeed the opposition on this side of the House, to the Chagos deal in terms of their citizenship and their identity of those islanders, and the security as well of our base. And to these, I must add, I have to add it, a caution of funding, as I see farms being attacked with the farming inheritance tax on one hand, and an open-ended cheque to Mauritius with the other hand. So will the Minister not rethink this terrible decision, or better still, with the division is quite clearly on this side of the House and that side of the House, let us make that decision?
Well, Mr Speaker, of course the House will have the right to make its decision in due course when legislation is put forward, and that's only right, and there will be, I'm sure, ample scrutiny. He has always had a keen interest for the interests of the Chagossians, which I deeply respect. As I've said, there are a range of different views within the community. Their interests are very much at the heart of this. And of course, he references citizenship. Of course, they retain that right that's been in place since 2022 for British citizenship, and of course many Chagossians have chosen to make their home here and to take British citizenship, and that's right. And we all agree that what happened historically was wrong.
Right, that completes the urgent question. To the statement, Secretary of State for Housing and Local Government, Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. With permission, I would like to update the House on devolution in England and local government reorganisation. The #1 mission of this government is to unlock growth in our regions and put money back in the pockets of working people. Every one of our proud towns and cities have a vital contribution to make to growth. But all of these promises of levelling up, when the rubber hits the road, government's first instincts have been to hoard power and hold our economy back. Since I launched the devolution white paper in December, I've been overwhelmed, Mr Speaker, by the excitement from communities wanting to join the devolution revolution. And Mr Speaker, with the measures I will announce today, if it all goes to plan, over 44 million people will see the benefits of devolution. That's close to 80% of the country. More progress in a shorter amount of time than any government in Britain's history. Today, I am delighted to announce 6 new potential devolution areas which will be part of our devolution priority programme, with a view to mayoral elections in May 2026. These places will get a fast-track ticket to drive real change in their area. While devolution can sound techie, the outcome is simple. It's a plan for putting more money in people's pockets. It's a plan for quicker, better, cheaper transport designed with local people in mind. A plan for putting politics back in the service of working people. So today, Mr Speaker, I can confirm to members across the House that the places on the devolution priority programme are Cumbria, Cheshire and Warrington, Greater Essex, Hampshire and Solent, Norfolk and Suffolk, and Sussex and Brighton. Mr Speaker, a 7th area, which is somewhat familiar to both of us, Lancashire, is already deciding its mayoral devolution options, and we will look at their proposals in the autumn in parallel with the priority programme. When I became Deputy Prime Minister, I promised that this government would change the future of the north of England, so Northerners would no longer be dictated to from Whitehall. The programme I announced today will see the north of England covered by devolution. But, Mr Speaker, this programme is for all of England and is shown by the significant progress in the east and the south. Today, legislation comes into force creating mayoral devolution in Greater Lincolnshire and in Hull and East Yorkshire, electing their first mayors this May, as well as foundational devolution in Lancashire and Devon and Torbay. Mr Speaker, every place can see a benefit from devolution, and we want to move quickly to release these benefits within the first term of our government. Whether it's more regular bus services, more affordable housing, or the simple fact that local people will have a local champion with regional influence. Mayors have a proven track record of delivering growth and higher living standards. But we are clear that where a mayor isn't using the powers to benefit their residents, government has the tools to ensure delivery. We will create strong accountability measures in the English devolution bill to ensure mayors deliver the housing, transport and infrastructure their residents need. But devolution is only as strong as the foundations it's built on. Despite the funding injection by this government, councils of all political stripes are in crisis. A decade of cuts and sticky plaster politics has left councils in a 14-year doom loop. That's why we're fixing the foundations of local government by reforming funding and focusing on prevention. I know how vital local government is for achieving our government missions. I also know that reforming local government means tough choices, choices that the Conservatives were simply too unwilling to take. Councillors of all types, including district councillors, tell me the two-tier system isn't working. So alongside our wider reforms, this government is committed to making simpler, more efficient and clearer structures so that residents can access good public services without eye-watering price tags. These kind of reforms, Mr Speaker, won't happen overnight, but we're determined to deliver fairer funding to end the postcode lotteries so that everyone gets the support from public services that they deserve. And that is why today I will be issuing a legal invitation to all 21 two-tier areas to submit proposals for new unitary councils. Letters and the accompanying written statement will set out the requirements for these proposals. New unitary structures will be the right size to achieve efficiencies, improve capacity and withstand financial shocks. But, Mr Speaker, I am clear about the need for flexibility when reorganisation goes hand in hand with mayoral devolution and when coupled with ambitious plans for housing growth. So these proposals will be developed with effective local engagement and dovetailed devolution arrangements. And I want to reassure members that this process will involve extensive engagement with local communities and members of this House. Now, Mr Speaker, turning now to the timings of local elections in May. For certain areas, a significant amount of work is needed to unlock devolution and deliver reorganisation. For this reason, some areas requested to postpone their elections in May 2026 until May 2026. The government's starting point is for all elections to go ahead unless there is a strong justification for postponement. And, Mr Speaker, the bar is high and rightly so. I am only agreeing to half of the requests that were made. After careful consideration, I have only agreed to postpone elections in places where this is central to our manifesto promise to deliver devolution. We're not in the business of holding elections to bodies that won't exist and where we don't know what will replace them. This would be an expensive and irresponsible waste of taxpayers' money. And any party calling for these elections to go ahead must explain how this waste would be justifiable. And to that end, Mr Speaker, I've agreed to postpone local elections in East Sussex and West Sussex, Essex and Thurrock, Hampshire and the Isle of Wight, and Norfolk and Suffolk. I have also agreed for the postponement in Surrey, given the urgency of creating sustainable new unitary structures and to unlock devolution for this area. For all these areas, I intend to move to elections to the new shadow unitary councils, as is the usual arrangements during local government reorganisation. Mr Speaker, we are postponing elections for 1 year, from May 2025 to May 2026. There is a well-established precedent here, as the party opposite knows all too well. North Yorkshire, Cumbria and Somerset, as well as Buckinghamshire and North Hampshire, all had their elections rescheduled by the previous government. Mr Speaker, I will lay the relevant secondary legislation for this when Parliament time allows, and local elections will take place as scheduled in all other areas. I should be clear, though, that all two-tier areas should be making plans to move to simpler structures regardless of election delays. The invitation will be sent to all two-tier areas with a timetable that takes into account their election has been delayed. Mr Speaker, I know the devolution journey may not always be comfortable for politicians in Whitehall, but it isn't supposed to be. After all, we are undergoing a generational power shift from Whitehall to the Town Hall. We have already seen a huge amount of goodwill from Labour Secretary of States willing to give up newly won powers for the sake of our towns and cities. Secretary of State for Energy, Transport, Work and Pensions and Innovation have led the devolution charge. And now the Prime Minister and I ask MPs in this place to do the same. And I commend this statement to the House.
Shadow Secretary of State, Kevin Hollingray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I can thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her statement and advance sight of it. Although supportive of the principle of devolving power to local areas, we are totally against her plans to abolish every county council and every district council in England, and the unprecedented mass postponement of local elections for at least 1 year. Today is a very worrying day for democracy in this country. She is making local government less accountable to the people and more accountable to her. Contrary to the Deputy Prime Minister's statement, she is not doing away with a two-tier system. She is simply creating a new tier of Orwellian-sounding strategic authorities, which are closer to her and closer to Whitehall. And these are for her to use as a pawn to implement this government's deeply unpopular socialist agenda. The reality is that this is delegation, not devolution, but a clear centralisation. As Dr Andy Mycock of Leeds University sets out in his recent paper on her plans, there are clear concerns about the potential power drain of backbench local councillors if local government is seen increasingly as a delivery agent. Let us be clear, this announcement is a huge upheaval of local government right across the country, but this was not a government manifesto commitment and she has no mandate for it. These are her choices, and she has put a gun to the head of local councils to force them into a decision with little regard for local people. This is not the invitation she claims in her statement, it is an instruction. No council should be bullied or blackmailed into local government restructuring. Local government should be local to residents and respect local identities. We have a proud record of supporting devolution where we worked with local people and delivered devolution from the ground up rather than this top-down approach. The government tried to claim that they were taking a bottom-up approach. Indeed, the Minister for Local Government said exactly that on the floor of this House on the 20th of January. Yet, in her very statement, she admits that all two-tier areas should be making plans to move to simpler structures. Whitehall diktats imposed on local people rather than the locally led approach we followed, which are prone to problems, especially when rushed. So the questions I have for the Deputy Prime Minister: how exactly does it put more money in people's pockets as she claims? What evidence has she got that it will mean lower bills for taxpayers? How is this consistent with the Prime Minister's claims in March of 2023 that council tax would not increase by a single penny when they're in government? Does she accept that she has no electoral mandate for this huge upheaval? Does she also accept that these changes, which will mean every single council employee in two-tier areas reapplying for their jobs, will impact on local services, including planning delays? And how will this impact on her plans to deliver 1.5 million homes in this Parliament, a 50% increase from the 50-year record levels delivered by the previous government? Councils in some areas of this country, including in this announcement, are carrying very high levels of debt, Woking and Thurrock to name but two. What support will she be giving to authorities faced with eye-watering levels of debt? And will this debt be written off? What is she doing to ensure that as a result of today's announcement that authorities do not embark on reckless asset disposal programmes and spending sprees? And can she confirm that elections will be delayed for a maximum of a year? Or is it the case, as we have heard, that elections could be delayed by up to 3 years?
Secretary of State. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, I've been very clear that Labour is embarking on a once-in-a-generation project to unlock growth in our regions and shift power out of Westminster and into local communities. I'm not quite sure where the benches opposite are. I can't quite figure out whether the Conservatives agree with it or whether they don't agree with it by that response, Madam Deputy Speaker. But what I will say in response to the right honourable gentleman's questions was, first of all, it will unlock billions of pounds of money so that we can spend on frontline services. And that's why councils have come forward and want to work with us to ensure that we deliver. And all local government reform applications to the priority programme and all applications to the statutory invitation for all two-tier areas will be for local areas to decide and apply. But we've made no bones about the fact that we want to see reorganisation, so money and funding goes into public services where they need it the most. Secondly, Madam Deputy Speaker, he talked about money. We've put £69 billion, a real 6.8% cash terms increase into local authorities. In contrast, Madam Deputy Speaker, 23% cut in the last decade under the Conservatives. So when he talks about council debt, it's his government that has pushed councils to the brink. And he talked about impact on local services. We are working with councils to inject the money and resources so that they can deliver for local people. It's his government that brought them to the brink. He talked about housing targets. I can't believe, Madam Deputy Speaker, he wants to talk about housing targets because his government failed to meet their housing targets every single year and has left us with a housing crisis. The former minister should be apologising for his government's record on housing. Madam Deputy Speaker, we're proud of the work that we're doing on devolution. We're proud that we're working with councils. We're proud that we're bigging up the work of our local authorities and we'll continue to support them, unlike the party opposite did.
Chair of the Select Committee, Florence Eshamurley. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I want to start by thanking the Secretary of State for bringing forward the government's ambitions in terms of devolution across England. I welcome the commitment into putting power into the hands of local communities so that people can actually feel that decisions are being made with them and not to them. I think it is fair to say that we've seen proposals come forward from areas, including Essex County Council, who want and welcome some of these changes, so we should respond to them. And in terms of some of the councils where elections will be postponed, again, we know that during the last government we saw 19 council areas where we had local council expansions. The expansion of the mayoral model is welcome, building on the success over the last few years. And this statement includes part of the country, if we're frankly honest, has been failed by successive governments in terms of tackling regional inequality. However, there are major structural reforms to local government. There are major reforms to tackling implementation in the last few years, and there are concerns around disruptions to services. And councils are already seeing that crisis, Madam Deputy Speaker, and the impacts it will have on the most vulnerable. So can the Secretary of State ensure that these transition arrangements will not impact the essential services so many of our constituencies rely on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for recognising that actually local councils and areas have come forward and this government is responding to their requests and working with them. I promised them when I became Secretary of State that there will be a different tone set by this government, that we will work with local authorities, we will respect them regardless of political colours, and that we will deliver for local people. I also welcome her comments on the mayoral model as well. We've seen how this has affected areas for positive change and dealing with local areas' concerns. And I also acknowledge the concerns that are raised around capacity and local services. We are making sure that we're working with local authorities to increase the support for them, to ensure that this is an exercise that will deliver better public local services for people, not a detriment.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Vicky Slade.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of her speech, but I am disappointed that we read the list of the cancelled elections on social media well before the list was made available to Parliament, and I would be interested to know how that was allowed to happen. A key pillar of our democracy is the right to vote. making your mark for the person you want to represent you. The Conservative councils that asked for and have been granted the right to cancel their elections have created crises in special educational needs and have let their residents down. And they should have been kicked out of County Hall in May, as they were kicked out of government last summer. But now they've been given the right to help design these new authorities. The plans, which also signal the end of the district councils, is completely undemocratic. The move to mayoral authorities is something that we welcome and was in train, and in fact as a former council leader we were working on it. But there is no democratic mandate for the cancelling of ancient cities like Colchester and the previous capital of England, Winchester. This was not in the Labour manifesto. So what I would like to ask is, what active role will these districts have in the co-production of the new unitaries? When will those district councils cease to exist? For the priority areas like Surrey and Hampshire, what assurance can she give that these elections will not go beyond May 2026? And for places that have had their own authorities for hundreds or even thousands of years, what support will be provided to develop meaningful town councils with statutory powers so that the identity of places like Winchester can be maintained forever?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And first of all, I'm disappointed when things are on social media first. I do respect this House, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I've come at the earliest opportunity to update the House on where things are at. And in terms of cancelling elections, Madam Deputy Speaker, those councillors in those areas are elected, and we've delayed only on exceptional circumstances for the reorganisation where they've come forward. And I've made it absolutely clear that this is for a year, so from May 2025 to May 2026. As I've stated in my earlier comments, I turned down many more because I do believe that democracy is crucially important. There is an active role for districts. We are working with districts and we are working across local authorities to ensure that consultation period and the reorganisation is with them, not to them. And I think that is incredibly important to stress.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Could I just follow up two issues? Following the chair of the Select Committee, while devolution arrangements have been put in place, there's still pressure on councils to deliver existing services. Could the Secretary look at some additional short-term funding to help councils through that process? And secondly, in the longer term, we're going to need a lot of very good councillors to deliver these new authorities. Could she have a look once again at reinstating the right for councillors to become part of the local government pension scheme, so that councillors who often give up financially to be a councillor don't give up financially for the long term with reduced pensions?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We do recognise the pressures on councils. That's why we're delivering a real cash increase to councils and £5 billion more in the settlement, Madam Deputy Speaker, which my honourable friend will be taking after the statements that we've had today. We do recognise that councils have had it really difficult under the previous administration, and that's why we're working with them. We're giving them real terms increases to their budgets, and we want to see reorganisation that focuses on delivery of service for the people who desperately need it.
Sir Roger Gale.
Madam Deputy Speaker, some of us have been around the local government reform circus on a number of occasions in the past, and I fear that the Right Honourable Lady is going to find that this piecemeal approach will be disastrous.
Yep.
While one of the oldest local government unions in the country, the Federation of Sink Ports, may heave a sigh of relief, I suspect that the districts and City of Kent and the County Council in Kent are going to find themselves between a rock and a hard place. We have one unitary authority, Medway, and two that we thought were going to be unitary authorities and now clearly for the moment aren't. How can the Secretary of State reassure me that we're not simply now going to be left with a lot of lame duck local authorities for the foreseeable future?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, first of all, I say to the Right Honourable Gentleman, he's not old enough, surely not. And then I also say gently to the Right Honourable Gentleman as well, we can't have it both ways where he's suggesting that this is piecemeal, but his front benchers suggesting that I'm tearing down local democracy. It's just not true. Local areas are coming forward and we're working with local councils and local areas. I've talked about the real terms cash injection, which my honourable friend will talk about in in detail later on this afternoon, but also the collaboration and the way in which we want to work with local authorities. I don't see any lame duck local authorities out there. I see local authorities of all political persuasions that are delivering vital public services that have felt absolutely pillared by the previous government, and I see a government now determined to change that.
Clive Lewis.
Madam Speaker, can I first of all congratulate the Secretary of State and her ministers for the work they've done on this, and also for the exhaustive consultations that have taken place between MPs and local councillors and councils and stakeholders. No one is being forced on this journey, but we in Norwich and Norfolk are happy to be on the express elevator to devolution. And I would also say, can I just make this point? After 14 years of austerity and cuts to adult social care and children's services under the last government, can the Secretary of State promise us that she will encourage these new local authorities to develop co-development, co-production on these services, that they will be taken in-house and we can end the privatisation and outsourcing that has ruined those services for so many years?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his recognition of my honourable friend the Minister's countless rounds of consultation, and dare I say his door is still always open to all honourable members to discuss devolution. I once at the Local Government Association conference called him Devo Man, Madam Deputy Speaker. I stand by those words. And in terms of adult and children's services in local government, they have seen significant pressures, and I think members across this House have recognised that in questions to the Prime Minister in other debates that we've had. And I do encourage local authorities and local services to see where they can co-design services and support people in their local areas. And this has to be, Madam Deputy Speaker, not about party politics, not about what happens there in Westminster. It has to be about delivery of these vital services that critically many people day in, day out rely on.
Sir John Whittingdale.
The Secretary of State is proposing to abolish Malden District Council covering my constituency and absorb it within a local authority which is going to be based miles away and where Malden's councillors are going to be massively outnumbered by councillors from areas with no connection with the district at all. How does that enhance local decision making?
Well, I say to the right honourable gentleman is that we're working with local areas. This is a bottom-up approach to how we deliver better public services. I also say to the right honourable gentleman it's his party that has pushed local authorities and local government to the brink, and he should be apologising and talking to his front bench and getting on board and supporting devolution, supporting local government reorganisation where it delivers for his constituents.
David Burton-Sampson.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and can I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her statement. I am excited that Essex, including Southend, will be part of this priority programme. I am also keen to see that local areas keep their local identity, and I'm sure the Deputy Prime Minister can give us some assurances of that. But I just want to address this issue of people being against local reorganisation, devolution and postponing the elections. The Tories on Essex County Council are fully supportive of our programme.
Very good leader.
Can the Deputy Prime Minister therefore give me some assurances that this delay of elections is right for democracy and also is right for the taxpayer, saving funds where local authorities will not exist in several months' time? Thank you.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, Madam Deputy Speaker. There is no point in having elections to a body that isn't going to exist within 12 months. And it will cost the taxpayers huge sums of money, which, quite frankly, is not warranted. And he's absolutely right also to recognise that it was the Conservatives in Essex that have come forward, and I commend them for that, that they want to reorganise and they want to see better services for their local area and power put into their local area. And on the member's point, my honourable friend's point about local identity, I say to him that absolutely, I mean, I'm a Mancunian, but I'm also from Tameside, Madam Deputy Speaker. Having a mayor, being part of the combined authority hasn't stopped Tamesiders being proud of our local area.
Sarah Dyke.
Madam Deputy Speaker. Disappointingly, the Heart of Wessex devolution deal was not included in the priority programme, despite the region being well placed to support the government's growth objectives and national resilience in clean energy, defence, digital technologies and food security. So could the Secretary of State confirm the options available for regions that are not in the priority programme but wish to move at pace to enable them to benefit by and deliver devolution?
Well, I thank the honourable member for first recognising the positivity that devolution can unlock for local areas. And it wasn't included in this round because it wasn't developed enough. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, I urge members and those local areas to continue to work with this government because we want to deliver for them, and we'll continue to make sure that we can deliver devolution across the whole of England.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And you will, of course, know that councils like Bradford have been cut to the bone. We've lost £350 million, 60% of our funding since 2010, forcing impossible cuts to social care, homelessness support and SEND services. And the reality is 14 years of Tory failures have resulted in our communities being devastated and our services being decimated. While additional council tax flexibility has been granted to places like Bradford, this is not a long-term solution. Frankly, not fair on residents to pick up the tab for 14 years of Tory failure. So will my honourable friend, the Deputy Prime Minister, confirm how this government will deliver a long-term sustainable settlement to put councils on a stable financial footing which must reflect real need?
Well, my honourable friend is right to categorise what the Conservatives have done to local authorities, and it's not a party political thing to say that. Many councils of all different political persuasions will say the way in which the previous government went about local government was very much not to respect them and not to fund them. The vital public services that local government delivers, we recognise that. We recognise what they do, and the Minister will be setting out the plans that we have to give sustainable funding for local government into the future, because we recognise they're vitally important and we consider the work that they do critical to this government's mission.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I invite the Secretary of State to publish the evidence that these local government reorganisations will actually, in the long run, save money, because there is none unless she can publish hard evidence. And can I also ask her to heed the warnings of the Chair of the Select Committee on her own side and the former Chair of the Select Committee on her own side, who are warning about the disruption of local government and by abolishing two-tier local government, that it will be a mess, that she will have to fund that mess out of central government funding. Otherwise, there will be more cuts in public services to pay for this reorganisation. Which is it to be?
Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I say he should speak to his colleagues in Dorset because they have made savings. They understand what local government reorganisation can deliver. And we've seen this up and down the country. His party used to believe in devolution and we've seen how that can deliver for local areas. And we can save money. But this isn't just about saving money. This is about creating devolution, pushing power out of Whitehall into the town halls so that mayors and local authorities can deliver public services that are responsive to local areas' needs, and that's what we're trying to deliver from the bottom up, working with local authorities. He should get on board.
Chris Curtis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I just take a moment to thank the many council leaders and council staff from across my area who have worked tirelessly to move the barriers and blocks out of the way in order to get a deal for Bedford, Luton, Milton Keynes